The soldiers had been searching for weeks, not on an open field, not at the gates of a city. They were climbing through the mountains of a small Mediterranean island, chasing an enemy that refused to stay and fight. The terrain was limestone and dense scrub, cut through with cave systems that went deep into the hillside and didn't come out the other side. This is where the Sardinians had been hiding. For years, the Roman legions had been on this island longer than anyone wanted to admit. The province should have been pacified by now. It hadn't been. A Roman army trained, disciplined, backed by the most organized military apparatus in the ancient world, kept arriving at villages that had already emptied. They kept climbing toward positions that had already been abandoned. They kept finding nothing where the enemy had been, then taking casualties when the enemy reappeared somewhere else entirely. It was not a failure of courage. It was not a failure of will. It was terrain. The Sardinians knew every cave and every path. The Roman soldiers did not. And in that gap, that small, irreducible gap between what the army could see and what its enemy knew, the whole campaign was stalling. Then the consul Marcus Pomponius Matho did something that had no clear precedent in how a Roman army was supposed to fight. He sent back to the mainland, not for reinforcements, not for siege equipment, not for orders from Rome. He sent for dogs. They arrived on chains, large, lean tracking hounds, bred for exactly this kind of work, for following a cold scent through rough terrain, for moving through darkness by smell alone, for leading human handlers to places no soldier could find unaided. They were released at the mouths of those caves, and the campaign that had resisted Rome for years came to an end. Marcus Pomponius Matho returned to Rome in triumph. Now, before we explain what those dogs were, where they came from, how Rome trained them and equipped them, and built a government program around them, before we explain the bureaucrat stationed in Winchester, whose entire official job was to select and export British fighting dogs to the imperial capital, or what a Roman poet writing in the reign of Augustus recorded about their combat performance, or what it means that Roman soldiers carved their names in marble when they died. Before all of that, there is something worth understanding about Rome that most history never stops to mention. Rome was the most systematic military civilization the ancient world produced. Everything it did that worked, it institutionalized. Roads, because movement was strategy. Engineering, because walls and bridges determined outcomes before battles began. Law, because discipline without structure was just violence. The Roman military did not simply fight. It built a machine for fighting, and then it maintained that machine with the same administrative energy it applied to taxation, aqueducts, and the management of grain. This is the Rome most people know, the Rome of the legions, organized, disciplined, methodical. Soldiers who moved and camped and fought according to written doctrine, who built fortified camps every night, even in friendly territory, who had specific people responsible for specific tasks at every level of the hierarchy. But there was another weapon in that Roman arsenal, one that no one built in a forge, one that breathed, bled, responded to commands, and was mourned by name when it died. A weapon that the empire imported, selected, trained, equipped, and deployed through a system as organized as anything else Rome ever built. The living weapon. What follows is the history of that system, not the story of a curiosity, not an anecdote about one exotic battlefield tactic, but the history of a state-administered program that ran for 7 centuries, stretched from the mountains of northwestern Greece to the island of Britain, produced a named government official in Roman Winchester, and left behind both military records and marble epitaphs. Understanding it does not change what Rome was, it deepens it. Because the same cold institutional intelligence that built the Colosseum also organized the procurement of the animals that fought inside it. The same administrative culture that codified Roman law also created a formal classification system for military dogs, different Latin names for different breeds and different roles, maintained across centuries of changing leadership and changing fronts. The Romans did not stumble into this. They made choices, deliberate, sustained, institutionalized choices about what living creatures were for and what living creatures could be made to do. And that is a more interesting story than anything you could tell about their siege engines. It is also a stranger one, and it begins not in Rome, and not even in Italy. It begins 600 years before Rome's war dog program reached its height on the other side of the Mediterranean, in a kingdom that Rome would one day absorb without ceremony. Around 600 BC, a king named Aliates ruled the small but wealthy kingdom of Lydia in what is now western Turkey. His kingdom was under attack. The Cimmerians, nomadic warriors from the northern steppe, had been raiding across the frontier, and Aliates decided to meet them in the field. He brought dogs, not as an afterthought, not as camp followers that happened to be present. He brought large, fierce dogs as a deliberate component of his battle order, trained and ready to be released against the enemy at the moment he chose. According to the Greek historian Polyaenus, the dogs fell upon the Cimmerian invaders, killing some and routing others. The detail that survives is specific. The dogs were particularly effective against the enemy cavalry. Horses not trained to work near large aggressive dogs will panic. They shy, they rear, they break formation before a spear is thrown or a sword is drawn. The damage is done before any human combat begins. That anti-cavalry function is important. It will appear again and again across centuries and civilizations, every time someone thinks carefully about what a war dog is actually for. Not its teeth, primarily, its terror. The Lydian example did not stand alone. Around 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses invaded Egypt. At the siege of Pelusium, facing Egyptian defensive forces using projectile weapons against his troops, Cambyses placed dogs along with sheep and cats, animals the Egyptians held sacred on the front line of his advance. The Egyptians, unwilling to risk injuring animals they revered, stopped firing. Cambyses walked through. War dogs as psychological warfare, not a charge, not an attack, a presence that the enemy could not respond to without violating something deeper than tactics. Closer to Rome, in the Greek world, the horsemen of Magnesia on the Maeander fought the Ephesians using a three-element tactic that later military historians would study. Release the dogs first, to scatter the enemy ranks. Follow with spearmen throwing into the disrupted formation, then charge with cavalry into what remained. An epitaph from that period records the burial of a Magnesian horseman named Hippomon alongside his horse, his spearman, and his dog, Lethargos. They were buried together because they had fought together. The dog had a name. The dog had a grave. In the mountains of northwestern Greece, in the region called Epirus, shepherds had been breeding a specific type of heavy mastiff for generations. The dog was not bred for war. It was bred for the work every shepherd's dog did, protecting flocks from wolves, guarding remote grazing land at night, confronting predators that most animals would run from. It was large. It was fearless. It attacked without hesitation when it believed its territory was threatened. It relied, as one ancient observer would later write, not on speed, but on abundant spirit and dauntless courage. The Molossian people who ruled Epirus gave their name to this dog, and the Molossian hound became the most admired working dog in the Greek world. Around 300 BC, it reached Rome. Not dramatically, not through conquest or tribute. The way most useful things moved in the ancient world, through trade, through military contact, through the slow diffusion of practical knowledge across cultures in constant exchange. Rome received the Molossian and did with it what Rome always did with useful things. It kept it, it used it, and, in time, it built a system around it. This is the moment to pause on something that the story of Roman war dogs tends to skip. Rome was not inventing anything. The Lydians had used war dogs in 600 BC. The Persians in 525 BC, the Greeks before that. Multiple unconnected civilizations across several centuries had arrived at the same conclusion independently, that there was something about this particular animal, this domesticated creature, that human beings had lived alongside for tens of thousands of years, that made it uniquely useful in the chaos of ancient warfare. The dog was fast enough to close distance. aggressive enough to confront a warhorse, trainable enough to obey specific commands, territorial enough to guard without being commanded, small enough to feed without devastating a campaign's logistics. No other animal in the ancient world combined those qualities in that combination. What Rome brought to this inheritance was not the insight. The insight was old. What Rome brought was the institution. The Molossian hound is extinct. The last pure specimens disappeared sometime in the centuries after the fall of Rome, as the breeding programs that had maintained them dissolved. What we know of the animal now comes from statues and mosaics and engravings that survive from the ancient world, the literary descriptions left by Greek and Roman writers, and the genetic legacy visible in the Mastiff-type dogs that still exist today, in whose bodies the shape of the original animal can still be traced. There is a marble sculpture in the British Museum, a Roman copy of a Hellenistic bronze showing a large resting dog, heavy-boned, broad-chested, the kind of animal that seems to occupy more space than its size should allow. It is calm in the pose, but the posture carries the impression of something not entirely restrained. That calm is described in the ancient sources. The Molossian was not a frenetic dog. It was steady, it waited, and when it acted fully. The Greek writer Oppian, composing his Synergetica around 180 AD, described Molossian hounds as dogs of steadfast valor, animals that attack even bearded bulls and rush upon monstrous boars, relying not on speed, but on abundant spirit and dauntless courage. Gratius, writing in the reign of Augustus, praised them in his poem On Hunting. When serious work must be done, when bravery is demanded, when the war god calls in the utmost hazard, the Molossians were the answer. These were not exotic imports kept at a distance from the soldiers. They lived with the army. The training a Roman war dog underwent was not the brief conditioning of an attack animal in a kennel. It was integration into a human community over months. The dog was introduced to the entire cohort it would serve with. Every soldier fed it. Every soldier handled it. The dog learned the smell of Roman armor and Roman clothing, and Roman bodies learned to distinguish friend from enemy, not by command, but by long familiarity. It patrolled the perimeter of the camp naturally, not because it was ordered to, but because it had come to regard the camp boundary as its own territory, the way all dogs regard the edge of their home ground. It also learned commands: the order to attack, the order to hold, the order to return. That last one was as important as any other. A dog that could not be recalled from pursuit, that kept going when the battle was over, or that turned on its own handlers in the heat of engagement, was a liability, not an asset. The training invested months, precisely because the difference between a useful military animal and a dangerous one came down to the reliability of that recall. The equipment tells its own story. The spiked collar is the recurring image of the Roman war dog, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The design did not originate in Rome. It originated in Epirus, among the same shepherds who bred the Molossian. They had learned through hard experience that the throat was the first target a wolf went for. A collar of iron spikes, angled outward, made that attack impossible. The wolf that tried to seize a guarded throat got a face full of metal instead. Rome took that collar design and brought it to the battlefield. The same object that had protected a flock in the mountains of northwestern Greece was now protecting an animal serving a Roman legion. The pastoral technology had become military technology without being changed at all. What changed was the context and the nature of what the dog was being protected from. Messages were sometimes carried inside these collars. A letter was sewn into the inner strap against the dog's neck, invisible from outside. The dog was released and allowed to run back to its home unit. It would not be stopped or searched the way a human messenger might be. It would not reveal anything under interrogation. It carried the message invisibly and delivered it through nothing more than the animal instinct to return to the place it knew as home. Archaeological evidence supports much of this. Spiked collars of the type described in literary sources have been found in Roman ruins. The physical objects confirm what the texts describe. For body armor beyond collar's leather plate, chainmail on the torso, the literary sources make claims that the archaeological record is less certain about. Where the evidence is firm, this story will say so. Where it is thinner, it will say that too. What is confirmed through multiple independent ancient sources is the classification system Rome maintained for its military dogs. Pliny the Elder, Plutarch, and others preserve the Latin categories: canes, pugnaces, attack dogs in their spiked collars, the premier fighting animals; canes villatica, guard dogs for camps and buildings; canes ner sagaces, the keen-scented tracking dogs; canes pedibus cleres, swift pursuit dogs. These were not casual descriptions. They were professional categories maintained by a civilization that had thought carefully about what different types of dogs were for and had named those functions accordingly. 4 roles, 4 names, 4 kinds of investment in 4 kinds of training. Rome did not have war dogs. It had a typology. The most documented of the 4 roles is the oldest and the most obvious: night sentry. Every Roman garrison in foreign territory was vulnerable to surprise attack after dark. Human sentinels could fall asleep, could be bribed, could be killed silently before the alarm was raised. Dogs could not be bribed. They did not sleep through unfamiliar sound. They could detect an approaching figure by scent before any human sense registered it, and their bark was itself a weapon. It woke the camp. Cicero, in a passage about security arrangements at the Capitol in Rome, mentions dogs kept there alongside the famous geese. The military writer Vegetius explicitly recommends dogs for fortress night guard. Plutarch records that Aratus of Sicyon, defending the citadel of Acrocorinth, deployed 50 dogs for every 400 soldiers. The messenger function was specific and strange. The tracking function was, as Sardinia proved, decisive in the right terrain. And then there was the 4th role, the one that the title of this video references: the front-line charge. Not all scholars agree on how systematic this was in Roman practice. The evidence for dogs as regular battlefield combatants is thinner than popular history often implies. What seems clear is that the anti-cavalry function documented from the Lydian Wars forward was real, understood, and used. A horse that had never encountered a large, aggressive dog at full charge did not need to be bitten to be broken. The flight response is physiological. The horse shies before it is touched. The cavalry formation breaks before any Roman soldier reaches it. The dog does the work, through terror alone. Whether that happened once, occasionally, or as standing doctrine varied by campaign and command, the Roman army understood the principle. The question was never whether it worked. The question was how to do it better. And that question was about to be answered by the last place in the known world anyone expected to provide the answer. The campaign in Sardinia had been going wrong for a long time before Marcus Pomponius Matho arrived. The island had been seized from Carthage in 238 BC, after the First Punic War ended, and Rome took what it could while Carthage was in no position to resist. The Sardinians had not been consulted about this arrangement. They rebelled. Rome sent an army to suppress the rebellion. The Sardinians retreated into the mountains and kept rebelling. Rome sent another army. The same thing happened. The island's interior limestone and scrub and deep cave systems cut into hillside terrain that the local population knew as intimately as the rooms of their own houses absorbed Roman punitive expeditions, the way water absorbs ink. The army arrived. The enemy vanished. The army left. The enemy reappeared. By 231 BC, both consuls for the year were dispatched to the islands: Matho to Sardinia, his colleague Gaius Papirius Maso to Corsica. This was a statement that the situation had become serious enough to commit the full weight of Rome's highest elected offices to its resolution. Here is what Matho faced: an enemy that would not stand and fight. That was not cowardice, it was strategy. Guerrilla warfare against a superior conventional force works precisely because it denies that force what it needs. The Roman legion was extraordinary at what it did. What it did was maneuver, encircle, and destroy formations of enemy soldiers in open engagement. An enemy that refused to form up and engage gave the legion nothing to destroy. There was no line to break, no flank to turn, no position to assault. There were only empty hills and cave mouths, and the bodies of Roman soldiers who had been ambushed and left behind. The information problem was specific. Matho could not find the enemy. Not because they were far away, they were right there, in the terrain around his army, watching, waiting, retreating into rock when the legions came near. What he needed was not more soldiers. He had soldiers. What he needed was something that could go where soldiers couldn't, follow trails that soldiers couldn't detect, and locate people who didn't want to be located in terrain designed to hide them. He sent for dogs from the Italian mainland. The account of what followed comes to us through a Byzantine chronicler named Zonaras, who was writing more than 1,000 years after the events he describes. His source material for this period was older, and his account is consistent with what we know of the campaign from other evidence. But we should be honest about the chain of transmission. This is not a first-hand record. It is a late source preserving a detail that someone thought worth keeping. What Zonaras records is this. Matho used keen-scented dogs from Italy to track the Sardinians to their hiding places. The dogs followed trails through terrain the army could not otherwise penetrate. The guerrillas, who had been invisible for years, were found. The campaign that had dragged on through multiple commands and multiple years came to an end. Marcus Pomponius Matho returned to Rome and celebrated a triumph. The precise breed of the tracking dogs is not specified. They were described as keen-scented, which suggests hounds of the tracking type rather than the Molossian attack dogs. This distinction matters. Matho was not deploying the war dog in its most dramatic role. He was deploying it in the role where its biological capability was most precisely irreplaceable. Following a cold scent through difficult terrain, doing what no human being and no mechanical device of the period could replicate. He was using dogs to solve an information problem. This is one of the things that gets lost in the popular image of the Roman war dog. The image is of an armored mastiff charging into a line of enemy soldiers. That is one version of the story. The other version, the one that appears in the clearest documented deployment, is much quieter. A tracking dog, released at the mouth of a cave, following a scent into the dark while a handler follows behind. The terror was the same. The guerrillas who had been evading Rome for years, who had used the terrain as their shield, suddenly found that the terrain no longer protected them. The animal on the other end of the scent trail did not care about limestone formations or underground passages. It followed what was there. It could not be deceived by distance. What this deployment proves, and why it matters for everything that comes after, is that the Roman war dog program was not built around spectacle or tradition or the idea of what a war dog was supposed to look like. It was built around a question: what tactical problem does this animal solve that nothing else can? Sardinia's answer was that it finds people who don't want to be found. The next frontier would give a different answer, and it would change the program in a way Rome had not anticipated. Because what Rome was about to discover through direct military contact on the far edge of the known world was that its dogs were not actually the best ones available. In 55 BC, Julius Caesar stood on a beach in what is now southeastern England and looked at what was coming toward him. He had crossed the channel with 2 legions. The British tribes had assembled on the shore, and they were not retreating. They came down to the water in chariots and on foot, organized in their own way. And among them, among the warriors and the spear carriers and the chariot horses, there were dogs, large ones, the kind that did not wait for a command before deciding what to do about a threat. Caesar was not a man who wasted words on things that didn't matter. His campaign journals are precise, focused, economical. When something was worth noting, he noted it. He noted the dogs. He does not name a breed. We should be careful not to invent a specificity that his text does not provide, but the military impression they left was worth recording. These were not dogs that happened to be present at a battle. They were part of what made the British resistance formidable. What Caesar encountered on that beach were mastiff-type animals, heavy, broad, with the jaw structure and the territorial aggression that characterized the Molossian family of breeds across the ancient world. But they were adapted to this particular place. They had been bred and worked in wet, forested, heavy terrain. They were acclimated to British weather, to British ground, to the specific landscape that British warriors had known for generations and Roman soldiers were encountering for the first time. Their horses were not Roman horses, their dogs were not Greek dogs. The combination of unfamiliar terrain, unfamiliar tactics, and unfamiliar animals was something Roman commanders filed away. Caesar withdrew. He returned the following year with more legions and a better plan. He did not conquer Britain, that would not happen for another century, but he brought back a clear military observation about what was living on that island and what it was capable of. Nearly 50 years later, in the reign of Augustus, a Roman poet named Gratius wrote a long didactic poem called the Synergeticon, a professional guide to hunting, dog breeds, and their qualities. Gratius was not writing casual verse. He was working in the tradition of Roman technical literature, the same tradition as Vegetius on military matters and Columella on agriculture, writers who documented practical knowledge systematically so it would not be lost. His passage on British dogs is the most important primary source in this entire subject. Paraphrasing carefully, Gratius says that if you are looking for beauty and elegant appearance, the British dog has one defect: it is not a handsome animal. But if you want a dog for serious work, when courage must be shown, when the full hazard of war demands the best the animal can give, then you could not admire even the renowned Molossians as much. The British dog exceeds them. Read that again. 250 years after Rome had adopted the Molossian as its primary war dog, a Roman writer writing for a professional audience, in the tradition of systematic technical documentation, had officially declared that the British dog surpassed it, not in looks, not in temperament for everyday use, in war, in the specific, demanding circumstances of military confrontation. The island at the edge of the known world produced a better animal than the Greek mountains had ever managed. 2.5 centuries of the Molossian. 2.5 centuries of importing, training, deploying, and refining the same breed. And the whole time, across the Channel, there was something better. This deserves a moment. Rome was not slow to adopt useful things. The Roman military had adopted Greek tactics, Carthaginian shipbuilding, Spanish swords. It had a long and well-documented history of looking at what its enemies did well and taking the useful parts. But the Molossian had been so thoroughly embedded in Roman military culture, in its poetry, its sculpture, its training doctrine passed across generations of handlers, that it took direct military contact with British warriors on their own ground to produce the recognition that a superior option existed. Gratius was documenting a shift that had already happened at the level of practical military knowledge. By the time he published the Synergeticon, Roman commanders who had served in Britain knew what the British dog was. The poem gave that knowledge official literary form. The import trade had actually begun before the conquest. The Greek geographer Strabo, writing in the first decades of the 1st century AD, noted that Britain exported dogs for hunting and that the Celts also used them in war. The trade existed. The knowledge existed. What had not yet happened was the institutional structure to turn informal knowledge into state practice. That structure was about to be built. In 43 AD, the Emperor Claudius ordered the full military conquest of Britain. 4 legions crossed the Channel. Roman forces met the major tribal confederacies in the field and defeated them. Britain became a Roman province, with all the administrative machinery that designation entailed: governors, tax collectors, road builders, and officials responsible for the province's exports. Among those exports were dogs. And among the officials Rome posted to the province was a man whose job was to find the best of them. His name has not survived. Almost nothing personal about him has survived. What has survived is his title and his location, and those two facts, taken together, are more revealing than any biography. The title was Procurator Synegii. The location was Venta Belgarum, the Roman town that is Winchester today, in southern England. Procurator was a standard term in Roman provincial administration for a senior official with specific functional responsibility. Synegi comes from a Greek root meaning hunt. The procurator synegi was, in plain terms, the steward of the hunt, the official responsible for managing the procurement and export of hunting and fighting dogs from Roman Britain. His office was a government post. He had authority granted by the emperor. He had a budget. He had a location that made logistical sense. Winchester sits in a region of southern Britain accessible by Roman roads to the ports that shipped goods across the Channel to the continent. He had, presumably, staff. He had, certainly, a function that the state thought important enough to formalize with an official title. Let that settle for a moment. Rome had a named government official whose entire professional responsibility was the acquisition of war dogs. Not a field commander who happened to deploy dogs in a specific campaign. Not a handler who trained animals for a particular unit. A civilian administrator, the same kind of official who managed the output of a province's mines or the collection of its grain, whose job was to select the best fighting dogs Britain could produce and send them to Rome. The same administrative culture that built Roman law built this office. The same civilization that created the most sophisticated legal system of the ancient world also created a procurement bureaucracy for its living weapons. This was not an improvisation. It was not an eccentric side project. It was policy, expressed in the standard form that Roman policy took. A named official, a formal mandate, a specified location. The dogs had two destinations. Some went to the arena. The Colosseum had been inaugurated in 80 AD, just decades after the conquest of Britain made the procurator's office necessary. The poet Martial, writing about the opening games held by the Emperor Titus, describes the spectacles staged there, including large dogs in action on the arena floor. The amphitheater served as something more than entertainment in this context. It was a performance environment, a dog that performed well in the arena, that showed the aggression, the endurance, the sheer physical presence that Roman military culture associated with quality, was a dog whose bloodline was worth maintaining. Around 8 AD, Gratius had described formal exhibitions pitting British dogs against Molossians in Roman amphitheatres, with the British type consistently prevailing. By 80 AD, the Colosseum provided a permanent venue for that kind of comparative evaluation. Rome watched which dogs won, the survivors reproduced. The breed was maintained at the level of quality that both military doctrine and public spectacle demanded. The second destination for the procurator's dogs was the army itself. Fighting dogs, certified by the procurator's office, were integrated into units where their capabilities were needed. This was not a spontaneous process. It was a supply chain. Think about what that means in full. A Roman soldier in Britain observed a local dog. A breeder produced that dog's offspring. A government official evaluated those offspring against formal criteria. The selected animals were transported to the coast, loaded onto ships, crossed the Channel, were distributed to units or to the arena, depending on their assessed quality, and entered the Roman military system where they were trained alongside the soldiers they would serve. From British field to Roman battlefield, a managed process with official oversight at every stage. No other ancient civilization, as far as the historical record shows, bureaucratized its war dog program to this degree. Egypt had fighting dogs, Persia had fighting dogs, the Greek city-states had fighting dogs. They used them and valued them. Rome measured them, classified them, assigned a government official to oversee their acquisition, and built a supply chain that spanned the empire. Here is the moral register that belongs in this part of the story, because the video has been building towards something that deserves to be said plainly. The procurator's job was the systematic procurement of living creatures for organized violence. He performed that job with official state authority, under imperial mandate, as part of the normal functioning of Roman provincial administration. The dogs he selected were not being sent to pleasant work. They were being sent to the arena to fight and die in public, or to the military to be trained, deployed, and eventually expended in whatever situation required them. Rome did not think of this as a moral problem. It was a resource management problem. The living weapon was a resource, to be identified, graded, transported, and used. The administrative culture that made Rome extraordinary also made it capable of this kind of cold-eyed systematization, applied to creatures that bled and aged and died. This is the moment in the story where the full weight of what Rome actually built becomes visible, and it is not entirely comfortable to look at clearly. There is something else that belongs here too. We will return to it at the end. For now, the procurement was complete, the training was done, the animal was ready. What happened when Rome finally let it work? A horse that has never encountered a large, aggressive dog at full charge will react in a predictable way. It will shy, it will rear. It will attempt to move away from the threat, breaking out of whatever formation it was part of, regardless of what its rider is trying to do. This is not a failure of training. It is a physiological response older than any cavalry doctrine, the animal's flight instinct activating in the presence of something it recognizes as predatory and close. This was understood in 600 BC. The Lydian war dogs at the battle against the Cimmerians were recorded as effective specifically against cavalry. The Magnesian horsemen who released their dogs before charging had codified this understanding into a repeatable tactical sequence. You do not need the dog to bite the horse. You need the horse to see the dog, to smell the dog, to hear it at close range. The cavalry breaks before contact. The momentum the enemy was about to bring against your formation is gone. You advance into disruption rather than into impact. Roman cavalry horses were trained to work near dogs. Roman war horses had heard them, smelled them, encountered them in camp over months of shared proximity. The desensitization was deliberate. What was natural to the Roman army's horses was unnatural to a Gallic warhorse or a Germanic mount that had spent its entire life nowhere near a trained mastiff at full charge. The asymmetry was tactical. Rome's horses held. The enemy's did not. This is the mechanism that most popular accounts of Roman war dogs describe without fully explaining. The terror is not metaphorical, it is mechanical. The horse's nervous system is the battlefield effect. The dog is the instrument that triggers it. The sentry function needs less explaining, but deserves the same precision. The dogs living within Roman camps were not performing a separate job from their integration into the unit. They were doing what territorial animals do when their territory is threatened, alerting, confronting, pursuing. The handlers directed and controlled that behavior, channeled it, amplified it through the camp's physical layout. A dog that has been allowed to patrol the perimeter and mark it as its own will defend that perimeter with complete conviction, not because it was trained to, because it is a dog, and that is what dogs do at the boundary of what they consider home. Cicero noted the dogs at the Capitol alongside the sacred geese. Vegetius recommended them for fortress guard in his military handbook. Their value at night, when human vision fails and other senses matter more, was obvious. A dog resting in a Roman camp in hostile territory was not truly resting. It was listening, in the way that dogs listen even while their bodies are still, with a sensory attention to sound and scent that no human guard system could replicate at any cost. The tracking function we have seen in Sardinia, the most effective documented tactical application, and the one where the dog's biology was most precisely matched to a military need. An enemy that can disappear into terrain has a decisive advantage over a conventional army. A tracking dog eliminates that advantage. The army's reach extends into every cave mouth, every forest depth, every hidden valley where a guerrilla force has made itself invisible. The information advantage is reversed. The messenger function was quieter and stranger. Messages in the collar. The dog released to run home. An invisible courier moving through hostile territory, carrying news that no human could safely deliver, because no human could pass through a contested area the way an animal can, and no captured dog would reveal under any interrogation what it carried against its own neck. And then there is the question of fire. Some ancient accounts describe what they call periphery fire-bearers. The cane corso type of Roman war dog, according to these sources, had incendiary material strapped to its back, and was released into enemy cavalry formations to create maximum chaos. The logic is comprehensible. A burning animal in motion is a source of unpredictable, spreading panic. Horses that might have held against a charging dog might not hold against a charging dog that was also on fire. The primary source basis for this practice is disputed. No confirmed direct passage from a named ancient authority has been conclusively identified as describing this as established Roman military doctrine rather than a reported possibility. The sources that mention it are filtered through multiple layers of transmission. This video presents it honestly. Some ancient accounts describe the practice. The tactical logic exists, but it cannot be confirmed as standard procedure. There is also a practical problem the ancient accounts tend to skip. A frightened animal does not run in a straight line. A dog on fire will not calmly continue toward the enemy cavalry in front of it. It will turn, and turn again, and go wherever panic takes it. The same fire intended for enemy horses might have returned toward Roman ones. Whether this was attempted and abandoned, attempted and effective in specific circumstances, or primarily a claim that circulated without firm factual grounding, the honest answer is that we do not know. What we do know is the four-part function that multiple independent ancient sources confirm across 7 centuries of Roman military history: guard, track, message, disrupt. 4 roles. 4 types of training. 4 kinds of military utility applied in the terrain and against the enemies that made each one necessary. The living weapon worked. If this kind of examination, the systems and institutions behind ancient military power, not just the battles, is worth your time, this channel covers exactly that. Consider staying with it. The Western Roman Empire did not fall in a single moment. It came apart over decades, through a process that historians continue to debate in its causes and its sequence. What is clear is that by the late 4th and early 5th centuries AD, the institutional structures that had made Rome what it was, the administrative offices, the supply chains, the professional armies, the provincial procurement networks were fracturing under pressures they could not absorb. The procurator synergy disappears from the historical record. Not dramatically, not in a moment of crisis that anyone described. The office that had functioned in Winchester, that had selected and exported British fighting dogs to Rome, that had fed both the arena and the army with the best animals the province could produce, closes or is abandoned, or simply ceases to be filled when the person holding it leaves and no one replaces him. The formal training programs end. The breeding doctrine dissolves. The accumulated knowledge about how to integrate a war dog into a cohort, how to use scent trails in counter-guerrilla operations, how to position dogs against cavalry, it was never written down in any surviving manual in enough detail to reconstruct. Vegetisus mentions dogs for night guard. That is almost all that makes it into the military literature. The rest existed in practice, in the hands of handlers and breeders and officials who knew it from doing it. When the institutions died, the knowledge died with them. The dogs themselves did not disappear. The mastiff-type animals that had been the backbone of the Roman war dog program dispersed into the agricultural life of post-Roman Europe. They became what their distant ancestors had been before the Molossian ever walked beside a legion. Guard animals for estates, farm protectors, working dogs in the employ of whoever needed a large territorial animal to keep strangers at a distance. The Roman institutional framework that had given them military identity dissolved. What remained was the animal. There is a particular kind of knowledge loss that historians sometimes call tacit knowledge, the knowledge that exists in practice, in hands, in the daily habits of people who do something regularly, but that is never written down precisely because it does not need to be written down as long as the practice continues. The Roman war dog program ran on tacit knowledge. The handlers knew how to integrate the dogs into units. The procurators knew how to evaluate military quality stock. The breeders in Britain knew what characteristics they were selecting for. None of them needed to write a treatise because the knowledge lived in the doing. When the doing stopped, the knowledge went with it. No one wrote the doctrine. No one composed the manual. 7 centuries of institutional practice left almost no written trace detailed enough to recover. This is worth sitting with, because it is a fact about how knowledge works that remains true long after Rome. But there is another part of this story, and it belongs here. Rome mourned its dogs. We know this because they left records of the mourning. A marble epitaph was erected, in Rome, in the 1st or 2nd century AD, for a dog named Margarita Pearl. The language on the stone is Virgilian. Not crude, not functional. It describes her resting in her master and mistress's laps, sleeping in their bed, being held. It expresses grief in the highest literary register the people writing it had available to them. This is not an isolated example. Dog epitaphs survive from across the Roman world. Soldiers in distant provinces carved their animals' names into stone. The dog that had lived with the cohort, that had eaten from the hands of every man in it, that had learned every soldier's smell and patrolled the camp boundary at night, that dog, when it died, was mourned by the people who had known it. The same civilization that built the procurator's office also wrote these inscriptions. The same institutional culture that selected animals for organized violence also grieved individual animals by name in permanent stone. This is not a contradiction that resolves easily. It cannot be explained away by saying Rome was complex, or that the ancient world had different standards, or that soldiers always grow attached to what they live alongside. Those things are true. They do not account for what the marble says. The marble says, "This animal was known. It was loved. Its loss was significant enough that someone chose to make it permanent." The weaponization was not the result of indifference. It was a deliberate choice, made by people who were simultaneously capable of indifference and affection, of cold procurement and warm grief, of building a government office to acquire war dogs and then carving their names in stone when those same dogs died. The paradox is not resolvable. It is simply true. The tradition did not vanish when Rome did. Medieval knights brought large dogs into battle and had their images carved onto tomb monuments alongside the knight himself. In 1518, Henry VIII sent 400 war mastiffs to the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, fitted with iron-spiked collars, the same design that Epirote shepherds had used to protect their flocks 1,500 years earlier. The Spanish conquistadors deployed fighting dogs against indigenous peoples in the Americas in the 16th century at a scale and a brutality that is documented in painful detail. The breed lineage runs forward continuously. Molossian, Pugnaces Britanniae, English Mastiff, and on through European warfare for a full millennium after Rome. Rome did not end the practice, it institutionalized it. Other civilizations inherited the institution without the institutional name. And then there is Shakespeare. In 1599, 1500 years after the Roman war dog program was at its height in a play about Julius Caesar, written for an audience in London who had never seen a Molossian and had never met a procurator Cinegi, Mark Antony stands over the body of the murdered Caesar and speaks, "Cry havoc, and let slip the dogs of war." Shakespeare was using a metaphor. He was reaching for a phrase that meant the unleashing of organized destruction, the moment when restraint ends and violence is released without limit. He had never seen the actual dogs. He did not know the history of the procurator's office, or the details of the Sardinia campaign, or the specific passage Gratius wrote about British fighting dogs in the reign of Augustus. But the phrase was there, available to him, woven into the cultural memory of the Western world by centuries of use, because enough people across enough generations had understood precisely what it meant to drop a leash and release something terrible. The practice was gone. The phrase survived. Go back to Sardinia for a moment. The cave mouth. The soldiers who had been failing for years. The handlers who arrived from the mainland with their chains. The dogs released into the dark. The campaign ended. Matho returned to Rome. The dogs did their work, and then what? They went back to the handlers who trained them. They went back to the camp. They ate from the hands of soldiers who knew their names. The living weapon was not separate from the life alongside it. That is the thing the records do not preserve very well. The weapon had weight and warmth and a name. It knew the sound of the horn that called it back. It returned when it was told to return. When the empire fell and the institutions dissolved and the doctrine was lost, the dogs that had been Roman war dogs became something else. They returned to what dogs had always been, underneath everything the empire had built around them: guard animals, farm animals, companions sleeping in someone's lap, their name not yet carved in stone, living the ordinary life that the living weapon had been before the collar was fitted and the handler picked up the leash. The institution is gone. The doctrine is gone. The marble is still there, in a few museums, in a few collections, with a few names still legible. Margarita, pearl. The collar is empty.